Will Brown was a worker in Omaha. There's a young woman by the name of Agnes Lobeck who was out with her date, partner, friend who would later become her husband by the name of Milton Hoffman. They said that somebody attacked them and they pointed to Will Brown as being the assailant. In her recounting of the story, it seemed nearly physically impossible that Brown could have done this. He was arrested and taken to the Douglas County Courthouse to await arraignment. And so they're whipping the crowd up. They're plying with liquor. This is a Sunday afternoon. And so they're getting everybody animated and riled up. And then they march downtown to Omaha. People begin climbing the Douglas County Courthouse, scaling the building. He was drug around downtown Omaha, and he was strung up by a light pole and then peppered with bullets. Regular people, most lay people, come to know Will Brown is through the really gruesome picture of his demise. And he's kind of splayed back on a pile of wood, and he had been lit on fire. And his body is charred, and there are a sea of smiling faces behind him. And so most people only know Brown in his death and not in his life. And so we see just this moment of just utter chaos. And although it's often called a race riot, I think it's fair to call it what it was, which is a lynching. It's estimated that about 10,000 people came out that night. And so it was a whole community event. As a historian, I think it's so interesting how these elements of the story are written out to make this a moment in time where people acted wrongly and not a long way of, or a long tradition of violence against the other in this community. From the very instant that this lynching occurred, it was understood as a moment in time, not tied to the anti-Greek riots of 1909, not tied to the lynching of George Coe, who was killed at almost the identical spot as Will Brown was. This was an isolated incident, not what Omahans do. There was also a county fair that weekend which had a, quote, darky exhibit. And the final thing that I think is interesting about the story that people don't often talk about is that mob began walking farther north to North Omaha, where the black kind of business district was, to burn it down like they did in East St. Louis, like they did in Chicago, those communities there. And black men got on the roofs with guns and said, turn around, you don't want any of this. We will defend our community to the last ditch. And the mob saw that and walked away. By reinscribing that story into this narrative, we shift from black people as just victims to black people taking an active role in community defense and to protect themselves, and really challenging this notion of passivity. The way that this story has been told since, in the 100 years that have passed, have always been a story of Omaha's redemption. This was a bad moment, and then we moved past it. But it took almost 100 years to get it integrated into the curriculum in schools. There was a professor at Creighton University who was barred from protesting to have a plaque to this. So this is also a fraught story of how we choose to remember the ugly parts of our history, and how by hiding them, by ignoring them, by not actually making it a part of our city, local, and regional history, we can absolve ourselves from the crimes that we have all benefited from.